Hello, everyone. It's Shane Conto, your Wasteland reviewer, and welcome to the Wasteland Watchlist here on the SPM Crew Podcasting Network. And this is my weekly show where I play a little bit of movie roulette, where my guests and I randomly pick a film from my enormous and obnoxious watchlist, and it could be basically anything, including the third film in a old 1930s and 40s horror franchise, which is exactly what we're doing this episode. But joining me for the third time on the watch list is Mr. Bubbawheat. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, it's good to be back. I'm always excited to have an excuse to watch a random movie. I don't watch nearly as much movies as I used to.
Well, and it's always fun because you never know what we're going to land on. And our last two episodes were a pair of really art house films from auteur filmmakers. And this time we're talking about The Son of Frankenstein. So this is indeed the third film in the Frankenstein franchise, which is part of the greater Universal horror movie, monster movie franchise. This came out in 1939, but here's a little bit of background. So, released January 13th, 1939. So, this was a January film on top of that. They even released horror films back in January, back in the 30s too. We got 99-minute runtime, directed by Roland V. Lee, starring Basil Rathbone, Boris Karloff, and Bela Lugosi. So two of those phases that you would 100% expect to be in a Universal horror movie, monster movie. This had a budget that ballooned up to $420,000. Like I said, this is the third film in the Frankenstein franchise. It introduced two very significant figures, one of which I think most people didn't realize Igor was not introduced until apparently the third movie in this franchise, despite the fact that the hunchbacked assistant from the original film, aka Fritz, usually gets that kind of look to them. And then also, I know I'm a huge fan of Young Frankenstein, and this is where the wooden armed constable comes from that Kenneth Mars played in Young Frankenstein and lampooned the character from this film. This was made after a successful re release of Frankenstein and Dracula. They thought this franchise was kind of dead in the water, and then they re released the two originals and it made a bunch of money again. So they're like, well, need to make some more of these. It's glad to see that Hollywood hasn't changed in like 90 years. Um, then the budget doubled due to delays related to weather and script issues, which apparently this film was rewritten like well over again. Um, the Ghost of Frankenstein sequel released in 1942 after this because, three wasn't good enough. They kept going. And they wanted Peter Lorre, who declined a deal because they could not get him over from 20th Century Fox to star in the film. This was originally titled After Frankenstein, and Claude Rains considered for the wolf role. And the film brought Bela Lugosi out of poverty. Apparently, he needed a paycheck, and he's just like, "Sign me up." And Universal gave him a nice bit of cash for doing this film. But let's dive in to The Son of Frankenstein, which tells the story of returning to the ancestral castle long after the death of the monster. The son of Dr. Frankenstein meets a mad shepherd who is hiding the comatose creature. To clear the family name, he revives the creature and tries to rehabilitate him because, that is a fantastic idea if I've ever heard one. But what are your general thoughts here on Son of Frankenstein?
I mean, I'm vaguely familiar with the franchise. I'm not like a
Mm.
huge classic movie buff. I'm honestly 50-50 on whether or not I've watched the original
Mm.
Frankenstein Universal monster movie. I know I've seen a couple of the other ones. I've seen a few other Frankensteins, like the Robert De Niro one,
Yeah,
and oddly enough, there's like an '80s anime based on a the Marvel Comics version of Frankenstein
interesting.
that I watched. It is really bizarre, but and I've recently watched Young Frankenstein like just last year, so
Mm.
I definitely could tell. I feel like a lot more than just the wooden armed guy was inspired by this film. I feel like they cribbed a lot of beats from this film in
Mhm.
general to make Young Frankenstein.
Well, because honestly, at the end of the day, it is about a descendant of Frankenstein coming back to the castle and doing it all over again. So, guess they basically did just lift the plot from this movie for Young Frankenstein, but, facetiously. But I guess what were you obviously you don't have a whole lot of background in particular with this franchise. I have seen Frankenstein and the Bride of Frankenstein quite a few times, but I did not realize how many other sequels actually followed in this franchise. I kind of thought it was just done. But I was wrong. But I guess what were some of your general thoughts on the film itself?
I mean, I thought it was pretty interesting. I think it was a little bit hard to take it seriously, especially having young Frankenstein being fairly fresh in my head. And I didn't read a ton of trivia, but I did read about, Bela Lugosi's involvement in this, and that he was originally just going to be like kind of a very small role, and he was just paid a pittance, but the director decided to beef up his role whenever he saw like what Bela Lugosi can do, and also in order to get him more money, like to keep him on set longer,
Mm,
and to get him paid more, um, and I believe that a lot of people that have said that this version of Igor is one of his best roles, aside from Dracula, and I think that that character especially is really interesting.
mhm. Which is so interesting because, like, I guess there's not a whole lot of layers to, let's say, Baron Wolf von Frankenstein, Basil Rathbone's character, who just like come back to home and it's just like, well, we're gonna save my family's name by making the same mistake over again. Um, the folly of man. But Igor is such an interesting character, and right from when you get introduced to him with like that weird, like messed up neck because he survived a hanging, and there's even a sequence where like the villagers confront him and interrogate him. And what was interesting to me about this film was my favorite scenes were a couple of just like talking scenes. Like that one, I thought that was really interesting because there was a lot of tension and a lot of conflict going on between the characters. I really enjoyed the moments between Wolf and Inspector Krog and their dynamic, and like Krog laying out like, here's my trauma and why I have a wooden arm, and like
Mhm.
getting that kind of depth into this because like otherwise like this is the third movie in a monster movie franchise that's rehashing the same exact beats from the first one. It's like, well, we found the monster again, better revive him. So I did appreciate like some of those moments where it added some interesting human conflict and dynamics into the story.
Yeah, I also thought it was interesting the way that they made Igor the villain, basically,
Hmm.
because he, the monster has kind of reverted back to being like more of a tool rather
Hmm.
than being an actual creature. And he is just literally Igor's tool that he's using him. Igor is using the monster to kill all the jury that hung him for grave robbing. And I also think that that scene with the village council is great, and I love the moment where the foreman is like, you were hanged and pronounced dead, and so you know what happens after that is God's will, and we're not going to hang you again just because the doctor's never been wrong over the course of 30 years, but he just happened to be wrong this one time, so we'll just let it go.
A lot of mistakes being made across the board here. It's just like I don't think that's a good enough excuse not to make sure you finish the job on this execution, but whatever. And it was probably one of the things I was a little disappointed about was the monster because in Bride of Frankenstein, he makes a lot of progress and makes decisions and communicates and becomes much more intelligent, which if you've ever read Frankenstein, like this was not what the creation is like at all. I know you referenced Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the Kenneth Branagh version of it with Robert De Niro as the
Mhm.
creation. Like that's much more to the book where like the creature is intelligent and seeks vengeance and it's just like you did this to me. And here it definitely reverts back to like Boris Karloff basically just like all back to how he was in the first film. And like the face makeup looks just as good, except for some reason his outfit just looks so like cheap to me. And
It's
it's
just
just
like a
like,
sheepskin rug.
yeah, and I'm like, did they not have the same budget for this one? Which that's the thing though, because I've never heard much about Roland V. Lee as a director. Looks like he made like the original Count of Monte Cristo in 34, stuff like that. But like this film is actually really well shot. And there's some
Mhm.
interesting shots, production design. I think the moments where you see Wolf and his family in like their big dining hall, like the edges of how the room is structured and stuff like that makes it very interesting. I
Yeah,
think
I thought it
both,
was. I thought that the shots of the castle were all, not quite, but I think Burton-esque is one
yes,
way to put it. Except, it's very clearly pre Tim Burton, but I
yep,
wouldn't be surprised if this is one of the things that inspired Tim Burton because there's not very many. Well, there's a lot of straight lines, but it's all crooked lines.
yes. It's interesting because I don't really think about it much in the first two Frankenstein films, but like there's probably a lot of German expressionism influencing these films because like a lot of German expressionism were early horror films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu and stuff like that. The illegal adaptation of Dracula. But being able to see how this is crafted together, and it has a pretty like visceral finale too, especially with what happens to the creature, and it's kind of shocking, and it's it has very interesting moments. Like I can see why this one isn't as iconic or well remembered as the other two films. This is also a tad bit longer. This is like almost 20 minutes longer than either of the first two films because like they're like a lean like 75 minutes those original films. And I just felt like this one had a surprising amount of depth to the story for like a third film in a franchise that's circling back to like back to where we began. We're going to revitalize this monster, but like the Igor character adds a lot of intrigue, and it's like is like obviously Igor did some grave robbing, but like is Igor wrong to be upset when he got hanged and then survived and it's just like, well, time to get revenge. And I love his design too, in particular, like his shaggy hair and his beard and his teeth. It just has like a very distinct look to it. And because I feel like most people see Igor as like the hunchback, like tiny, like henchman of Dr. Frankenstein. And I feel like that's probably because I think they kind of just combined the name Igor with what Fritz was in the original Frankenstein. And obviously they ran with that joke in Young Frankenstein with Igor. Um, but like I was a big Van Helsing fan when I was, 13 years old when that came out. And like the Igor in that's much more this Igor. And I thought that was very interesting that they went in that kind of route with like longer, leaner, kind of disformed and angry. And I thought Bela Lugosi was the one that like really stole the show in this one. I think Basil Rathbone does a really fine job of being like, I'm rich, I'm a baron. I do think what's it, Lionel Atwill, who played the inspector. I thought he gave a really good performance. I just feel like Boris Karloff got a little bit wasted in this one. He was a lot less interesting this time
Yeah.
around. But
Yeah, even
honestly,
though the monster did have like a little bit of, plot to him and a little bit of character, but most of that happened off screen because he still
mhm,
had, they brought back his relationship with a child, with
Mm,
Frankenstein's son. But that all happened off screen. We would only see it through the kids' stories talking about the
yeah.
giants, the friendly giants that comes through the wall, and
Which that was also really
gave him
creepy.
his yeah, and gave him the pocket watch of their dead butler.
Yep. That was some like twisted stuff going on here. I'm like, Igor's playing some 5D chess over here. Um, Traumatizing and confusing this young child and playing around with that for sure. And I thought those moments were really interesting. I just I was just kind of shocked that like Igor wound up being like the character in this movie and had a lot of depth and layers. And yeah, Bela Lugosi gave a really great performance in this. Um, I did not expect much out of this film, to be honest. Kind of thought it was a cash grab, which here's the thing, it was. But a cash grab could be a fine film too. I It makes me wish that more people would check out like this one because obviously Frankenstein and especially Bride of Frankenstein has gotten a lot more attention over the years as being arguably the better film. But I really enjoyed this film quite a bit, and it had some great moments, had some strong characters. But I guess, do you have anything else that really stood out to you about the film?
I don't think so. I haven't talked much about the inspector myself, which I also thought that he was a great character, and I thought that he was entertaining without being as over the top as like young Frankenstein. I thought that he handled
What's
the fake arm, very well. I thought that it was believable and, humorous, but not being completely absurd. And especially like towards the end where he's like coming in with Frankenstein. And I think it's funny because in a lot of stuff that I read, it's like whenever Frankenstein is playing darts with the inspector, and it's like, no, he's not playing darts with the inspector. Dr. Frankenstein is just throwing darts, and the inspector is standing there. And like the first time, it's he doesn't have his hat on, and then the second time, he's like, "I'm wearing my hat. Do you know what that means?" It's like, does that mean that I'm under arrest? Yes, it does.
which they lampoon that character so perfectly in Young
Mhm.
Frankenstein. It was hard for me for a second to not just automatically go to Kenneth Mars and like, here's dinner for dinner. What? We're gonna have to go to the castle. And his whole like the Doctor Strange love of it all, with
Mhm.
how his wooden hand has like a mind of its own and stuff like that. And even the dart thing where he just like jams them all into the dartboard and it's like, and I that was just this actually watching this movie made me appreciate Young Frankenstein even more because now I'm like, now I get more of these references. But some good characters, a great cast for sure. And I'm looking at some more of these stills and just the shadow work, the lighting, the cinematography in this is really on point for sure.
And the Terminator 2 ending.
Yes. It is exactly like the Terminator 2 ending, except well yeah, I guess it was more the T1000's ending than, the T100, T800. I always get that mixed up. Arnold had a much nicer, like, I'm going to make a sacrifice, thumbs up kind of ending. The T1000 died a very horrible death, with a lot of pain, apparently. And that's exactly what happened to the monster at the end of this movie. But I can guarantee you the monster will be back in the Ghost of Frankenstein, I'm sure. Now I'm tempted to go watch that. I'm like, can they keep this streak going? I don't know. Based off of the title, I'm just like, this sounds like it's going to go a little weird. Like this wasn't weird enough. But no, this was a fun time. It was an interesting watch. I would definitely recommend if you haven't watched the original two Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein. I know I have one of those nice like four movie. I have two four movie Universal monster movie packs, and one of them, I think one of them has Frankenstein, the Bride of Frankenstein, Dracula, and the Creature from the Black Lagoon in it. And I'm like, one of these is not like the others, but it's still a really fun time. But
Yeah,
That's a
I
wrap.
managed to watch it. On
Uh,
I did a search on my Roku, and it's brought up, one of the random streaming apps. Is called like Essential Sci-Fi Classics, and
Interesting.
it has that and like maybe about 100 other like practically almost public domain
Yeah.
sci-fi movies. A lot. I'm definitely a lot of stuff that's being covered on MST3K,
Yeah.
and it was kind of weird though because it only showed like it showed a commercial like every 10 minutes or so, but it was only a single commercial and it was for like I guess there's a group of apps that are all under this same banner, and it was just like an ad for the network, and that was the only ad. But it would
Interesting.
still show like every 10 minutes.
Like self-promotion.
Yeah.
Nothing like self-promotion. Um, but those are our thoughts on Son of Frankenstein. Make sure to like, comment, and share on this episode. Tell us what your favorite, if you have any, have dove into the Universal Monster movies. And make sure to like, comment, and follow or subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast. The SPM Crew Podcasting Network is ever expanding. If you're interested in joining the crew, whether at starting up your own podcast or joining as a guest on a show like this, make sure to reach out. And if you like our logo, check out HiFlyer Creative for all your digital marketing needs. But real quick, but we thank you so much for coming on as always and talking some movies with me.
Anytime.
And most importantly, thank all of you out there for always tuning in and supporting the Wasteland Watchlist here on the SPM Crew Podcasting Network.